This doesn't look like Iraq. Mountains rise, sharp and sudden, instead of endless deserts. Green valleys, thick with walnut and poplar, replace dust and sun-bleached rock. Cold, thin air moves through ancient stone villages clinging to slopes. Most people never imagined this part of the country. Their mental map is flat, a monochrome of sand and strife. And that's the first shock. The cognitive dissonance of a landscape that defies every expectation. Because northern Iraq tells a completely different story. One written not in headlines, but in the bedrock of survival, the deep wells of identity, and the living archive of memory. One where the land changes everything. Geography doesn't just surround people, it sculpts them. In the north, mountains do more than define the landscape. They act as ancient, silent guardians of culture. These are the Zaggros, a crumpled spine of limestone and resilience. For centuries, communities here lived in the folds of these peaks, beyond the easy reach of sprawling empires and central armies. Borders shifted, treaties were redrawn, and capitals fell in the plains below them. But life continued, adapted, in the high villages above. Here's the contrast, stark and simple. While power changed hands repeatedly down on the Mesopotamian stage, Ottoman, Persian, British, Arab, the old rhythms persisted up here. Language, music, and tradition stayed rooted, watered by meltwater and isolation. The land, austere and demanding, made that possible. It offered not riches, but refuge. 2. A history written in stone. Ancient towns cling to cliffs like lichen. Stone houses, hewn from the very mountain, stack into hillsides in a gravity-defying puzzle. Walls, now part of newer homes, still trace defensive lines drawn hundreds of years ago against forgotten threats. These places weren't built to impress. They were built with a single urgent purpose: to endure. Each flat roof is the floor of the house above. Each narrow alley is a calculated choke point. What shocks most visitors isn't the age. It's the palpable continuity. The scent of bread baking isn't from a museum exhibit, but from a kitchen where generations have kneaded dough. People didn't abandon these towns when modernity called. They adapted, weaving satellite dishes into rooftops, running cables over medieval stone, proving that endurance is not stagnation. And then the story shifts, from the physical to the profoundly personal. 3. A people who never left. Northern Iraq is a mosaic, home to communities: Kurdish, Assyrian, Yazidi, Turkmen, others, who have endured the tectonic plates of history. They faced forced migrations, erased borders, and broken promises written in distant capitals. Yet, a core identity remained. It had to. Language was passed down in homes when schools forbade it. Music survived on the daft drum and the zurna flute, played at weddings in hidden valleys. Stories were remembered, not in books, but in the spoken word around stoves in long winters. Here's the part rarely mentioned in history's grand narratives. Culture doesn't disappear only when it's attacked. It disappears when it's forgotten, when the children no longer want to hear the old songs. And that forgetting? It never happened here. The mountains were a great amphitheater for remembering. 4. Celebration as resistance. Music, raw and rhythmic, echoes through mountain valleys, bouncing off rock faces that have heard these scales for millennia. Dances form circles that include everyone, old, young, a moving chain of connection. These aren't performances for visitors. They're declarations, a communal muscle memory. Celebration here isn't about joy alone. It's about active survival, a defiance of oblivion. Every song is a ledger of the past. Every step in the Dadka line stamps the earth to say, we're still here, we still remember. If you're drawn to places where culture survives not in museums, but in morning rituals and evening gatherings, where stories live in the landscape, far beyond the churn of headlines, subscribe. This channel exists for people who want to see the world deeper, to look past the postcard and find the pulse. 5. Beauty most people never see. Snow-capped peaks in winter, melting into emerald pastures in spring. Hidden valleys where wildflowers bloom in secret. Rivers like the Greater Zab, cutting through gorges, carving the rock over eons. This landscape of dramatic, quiet grandeur rarely appears in media depictions of this nation. And that absence matters profoundly, because it shapes a single-story perception. What the world often sees is conflict, a map of factions and fire. What it misses is this beauty, not delicate, but quiet, resilient, and enduringly real. A beauty that is the backdrop to daily life, not an escape from it. And then, there's the silence that isn't empty. 6. What staying silent protects. Some places don't advertise themselves. Their value is not in their accessibility. They survived historically by being overlooked, by being a hard target for conquerors who preferred easy plains. Isolation became a form of protection. Distance became a strategy for survival. This region wasn't frozen in time. It was fiercely selective about what it shared with the outside world. It gave up its secrets slowly. And that conscious decision preserved something increasingly rare in the world: cultural continuity, an unbroken, if often frayed, thread. 7. Why this part of Iraq feels different. Visitors, often wary, describe northern Iraq with the same unexpected words: calm, grounded, authentic. Not because life here is easy. It is often harsh, with scarce resources and a difficult past. But because identity is secure, worn without performance. People know who they are here. They know the names of their ancestors' villages. They know which mountain their grandparents hid in. That deep-seated certainty, forged in adversity, changes everything. It tempers the present with the long view of history. 8. The final contrast. Northern Iraq isn't loud. It doesn't demand your attention with neon or grand monuments. There is no blaring soundtrack, no forced spectacle for the outsider's gaze. But it leaves an impression, a quiet vibration in the bones, that stays long after you leave its crisp air and descending switchback roads. It's the memory of a specific texture, the cool, rough surface of a 1,000-year-old wall, the taste of strong tea sweetened with mountain honey, the particular hush that falls over a village at dusk, broken only by the distant bells of sheep and the low murmur of a conversation you can't understand but feel in its cadence. It reminds you that survival isn't always dramatic, loud, or victorious in the classic sense. It isn't only flags planted on battlefields or speeches in palaces. Sometimes it's quiet. It's a grandmother humming a lullaby in a language that has no country. It's the deliberate, patient act of rebuilding a stone terrace on a mountainside, the same way it was built 3 generations ago, because the soil it holds will feed the next one. It's the choice to wear a traditional pattern woven into fabric, not as a political statement, but as a simple, unyielding fact of being. It is the monumental act of continuity, of staying, of remembering, of baking the same bread in the same tandoor oven, as empires rose and fell in the distance. This is the resilient, everyday whisper that ultimately drowns out the historic noise. This was Iraq, not one story, but many layers like the strata of those mountains. Cities that invented civilization on the southern plains, sacred places shaped by millennia of profound faith. And here in the north, mountains that protected memory like a sacred trust. If this series changed how you see the world, even slightly cracking open a single stereotype, subscribe, because there are many more layers, many more places the headlines never show, where the true story is lived, not broadcast. And this journey to find them has only just begun.